So we have joining us from Fragomen, Nancy Morowitz and Scott Leeb. Nancy leads the firm's legal strategy and knowledge group, which is responsible for monitoring and analyzing federal, state, and international immigration law developments and providing guidance on complex legal issues, cases, and policy matters. Nancy speaks and publishes widely on immigration issues, and she served as executive editor of the Fragomen Global Business Immigration Handbook, an analysis of immigration laws and procedures. And I can't imagine a busier person at this moment than Nancy. She's a graduate of Tulane and is admitted to practice law in New York and Maryland. And Scott is the Chief Knowledge Officer, and he leads the Fragomen Knowledge Group, which is fully dedicated to the creation, curation, and management of the firm's knowledge. Scott is responsible for making Fragomen's worldwide immigration knowledge readily available to keep the Fragomen teams informed so they can provide services to their clients and keep their clients apprised of the latest developments. Together, they're going to present information to us about immigration, and more interestingly, they're also going to take questions from us, so we're excited about that. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll let the team from Fragomen decide who's sharing to what, and we'll start there.
Okay, I put the request in. Hi, everyone. Thank you.
You should be able to share now.
Okay, great. Okay, now for something entirely different. Thank you all for being on this call, and thanks to Rand and Lynn for the opportunity to speak on this topic, looking through the kaleidoscope, immigration and mobility policy in 2025 and beyond. As mentioned, my name's Scott Leeb. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at Fragomen, which is a firm that specializes in global immigration and mobility solutions. As head of the knowledge group, it's my responsibility to look at changes in the immigration and mobility environment, sense make around those changes, and then provide staff as well as clients with insights that help them with their decision-making and strategic planning. And probably about 500 times a year, we put out something called client alerts. And I saw Nancy, one just came out literally a few minutes ago, hot off the press, looking at changes in policies and procedures in the immigration space, and then providing insights on that. We also put out something called the Worldwide Immigration Trends Report, which will be coming out in about a week and a half or so. And I encourage you to go to fragomen.com. You can sign up for these alerts, and you can sign up for the Worldwide Immigration Trends Report. Now, one of the key trends or themes we looked at this past year was elections around the globe and how they were shaping the mobility and immigration policy. In November of 2023, The Economist, this is a headline, this is the cover from The Economist, calling it the year of the vote. It was the first time in history over half the world's population going to vote in national elections, 4.2 billion people. Just quick statistics, 7 of the 10 largest, most populous countries in the world held national elections, 20 presidential elections, 30 legislative elections, all 27 member states, EU parliamentary elections. And what I think was what was interesting about this is we look at the results. Some went to plan. The most obvious, Vladimir Putin was almost unanimously reelected. Some sort of went to plan, and I would put South Africa and India in that group because they, the party that had been in power won majority, but not an absolute majority. So in the case of India, you had the BJP winning and having to put together a coalition. Luckily, they put it together with like-minded folks, more regional parties. So what we expect is in India policy to remain the same. South Africa, however, different story. The ANC had been in power since 1990, absolute power. They won again, but not a majority. What they did was they reached across the table and created a rainbow coalition. They partnered with the opposition, the Democratic Alliance, to form the government. So Those sort of went to what we expected. Then, of course, you had France, which completely unexpected results there. So, across the board, no consistency. We firmly believe, though, with all these elections, this would shape immigration and mobility policy for a number of years. The question really is, what to make of it to date. Now, what's interesting is you look at these elections. Of these elections, three topics came up. First was the economy, not surprisingly. Second, not surprisingly, national security. But the third one that came up was the immigration issue. And what we have really been seeing is since really around the mid 2010, 2015 or so, really an increase in restrictivist policy around the globe. This was due, I think, to the large number of immigrants coming into Europe about that time, but we saw this in the UK elections. We saw it notably in 2016 in the US elections, and we've seen that continuing really, although obviously things were much different during the COVID period. And we saw that up to about a year or two ago. Now, what you're seeing is, in the argument for restrictivism, on the one hand, you have the politicians and the pressure to protect the domestic labor force. On the other hand, you have the economists who say you need fresh ideas. This is what causes innovation. This is what allows vitality and such. And so for a long period, from about the mid 2010s, we saw the politicians holding sway. About a year and a half ago, we began to see sort of the economists beginning to win the argument, and there were a number of reasons for this. First, quite simply, as we all know, the world's getting grayer. Aside from in Africa youth bulge, every other place on Earth, the population is graying. Interesting statistic I saw that if you look at China and look at just the 60+ age group, and you broke them into their own country, they'd be the fourth largest country in the world, right behind the United States. Another factor contributing to this, this issue is the students coming out, the college degrees today don't seem to match the skill sets of of what's needed in this technology-infused environment. And so what you're seeing is huge pressure, skilled labor. There's just not the skilled labor, so there's the push for this rise in restrictivism. And so we've seen the elections, and looking back at the elections of the past year, as you saw, some things made sense, some didn't. We were predicting restrictivism would be on the wane, and then the EU elections mid-year sort of pushed us back right. A lot of factors, and in fact, two other factors. Hey, let's face it, politicians say one thing to get into office. Oftentimes, they either change their tune or they just find it too difficult to change policy. So a lot of this remains to be seen. There was an instance in the Netherlands where there was, in November of 2023, a gentleman by the name of Geert Wilders won the election. Now, he was stridently anti-immigration, kind of build the wall type anti-immigration. And he won his party won election, so he, as the leader, stood to be the prime minister. But several months later, he got in front of the cameras and said, "I will not serve as prime minister." Simply, his views were too polarizing. So we're seeing these sort of challenges going forward. But clearly, as these elections play out, we'll get a much better sense. The story isn't told yet. You see here late in the year there were the elections, and then going through the next 10 months or so, the elections are coming up. And so this will largely help understand kind of where immigration and mobility policies on a global level turn. But in talking with Rand, he said that this group was extremely, extremely interested in the October Cameroon presidential election. So I just wanted to take a minute to talk about that. You have Paul Biya, 91 years old, as president, second longest serving president in Africa. If he wins as expected later this year, it will be his eighth term. If he doesn't win, more than likely the new president will be 90-year-old Speaker of Parliament. I just realized this is the wrong presentation. You're not interested in the battle between elder politicians in Cameroon. It's the one in the United States that you were most interested in. Luckily, Nancy's on the call. Nancy is a partner in our firm. She is the head of U.S. knowledge. And as you pointed out, Lynn, she is the hardest working person in our firm right now with all these changes that are taking place. So she's here to talk a bit about what we've seen in the first 10 days of the second Trump administration, what we could possibly see going forward, and what some of those implications are. So at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions, but wanted to turn it over now to Nancy to talk about the U.S. side of things. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks so much to Lynn and Rand. Well, I've always appreciated Scott's incredibly dry sense of humor, and that was maybe the best setup I've ever had in my life. So moving on to what we're seeing in the Trump administration and what we can expect. And I think we can advance the slide by one. So we are now 10 days into the new administration, and we've seen just a great deal of activity around immigration and certainly many other issues, which we expected. This is an administration that is returning to office with, kind of 4 years out of office to plan, to prepare, to learn from some of its, missteps during the first Trump administration. And so they've hit the ground running in a big way. And as we know, from the campaign, one of the key issues, if not the key issue, was second only to the economy, was immigration. And we've seen executive orders and other actions from the White House, on day one, and we're continuing to see them almost each day of the last couple of weeks. And those have really covered a full range of immigration-related issues. Certainly, border enforcement has been a priority as it was, throughout the campaign, and was also a major focus during the previous administration. We've seen an executive order that is purporting to limit the right of persons born in the United States to have citizenship on the basis of their birth year. We've seen a lot of executive orders pertaining to travel, and particularly enhanced screening of travelers into the United States. Interior enforcement, it goes hand in hand with border enforcement, and we're already seeing workplace raids and arrests of foreign nationals who are deemed to be criminals or to be undocumented. Those are already happening with great frequency in major cities around the country. We've seen a suspension of many of our humanitarian programs. So right now there is a complete pause on the resettlement of refugees in the United States, and applications for asylum, particularly at the US-Mexico border, are also on hold. And then we've also got this very, very interesting dynamic that is solidifying within this administration, and that is a debate between sort of the far right immigration restrictionists of the party and the cadre of advisors to the Trump administration, and headed by Elon Musk, a faction that is interested in immigration as an economic benefit to the United States. And Musk is joined by other, very senior tech executives in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. So let's dive into the details. And please, if you have questions, comments, please do feel free to enter those in the chat if we're able to see that, or or speak up. There's a lot to cover here, and I'm going to try to do it all in a rapid 20 minutes or so. So one of the things that we were anticipating kind of on day one of the administration was travel restrictions. And specifically, we were looking for the possibility of an outright travel ban of the kind that we saw in the first week or so of the first Trump administration. We didn't get that. We got a lot of executive orders that are basically directives to federal agencies to take the next 30 or 60 days to come up with recommendations for travel restrictions. And there are probably a couple of reasons for that. I think, as I mentioned, the administration learned from some of its missteps during its first term, and one of those was a lot of confusion and a lot of lawsuits around the travel bans that were issued and revised in the first weeks and months of the first Trump administration. So now they're taking a more deliberative approach and asking agencies to make recommendations. So those are countries that might be subject to a ban. But I think it's important to think about travel bans not just focused on nationals of specific countries. We're certainly likely to see something that looked very similar to the ban on travelers from majority Muslim countries that we saw starting in 2017. But it's also important to think about other types of bans, public health related bans. So we're no longer at the height of the COVID pandemic, but we know that this administration is looking very hard at other public health concerns as the basis for future travel bans. That could mean, say, outbreaks of tuberculosis, either abroad or within perhaps some immigrant communities in the United States. Other kinds of bans could be more related to economics. And one of the interesting things about President Trump's executive order on protection of the United States, it doesn't only call out national security and sort of physical threats. It also calls out things that are against the economic interest of the United States. And there are many in the administration or advisors to the administration that feel, some or all immigration is really a threat to the US workforce. So when we think about travel bans, it's important to think broadly in order to be prepared for what we might see in the next couple of months. We're also seeing a call for enhanced vetting, which in the previous administration was known as extreme vetting, and you're probably all familiar with those calls. I think it's important to understand that all foreign nationals coming into the United States are already subject to a very high level of vetting. If they're applying for a visa at a US consulate, they are being fingerprinted, they are being photographed, their backgrounds are being checked and run through national security databases. And the same is true, when they're inspected, or similar things happen when they're inspected at the US border when they present themselves to enter the country. I think what we're likely to see in the new administration is that more people who perhaps were accustomed to a fairly straightforward security check and vetting may find themselves on a more routine basis being scrutinized even more closely. And one of the things that this administration is very interested in doing is looking closer at ideologies that individuals may subscribe to and affiliations. And that may be, one of the ways that they can do that relatively easily is by looking at social media usage. That already goes on to a certain extent, but it's likely to affect a broader swath of travelers to the United States, and possibly those who are not accustomed to that kind of treatment when they travel back and forth, say, on business or on international assignments to the United States. And lastly, I've mentioned enforcement issues, at the southern border and, in terms of raids and other things that are going on. But one of the things that can affect a lot of folks who are here in lawful immigration status, particularly professionals who are working in assignments here in the United States, is that the Justice Department has been asked to look more broadly at the sort of immigration-related offenses that could subject somebody certainly to penalties, but also to, fairly draconian things like detention. And some of those infractions are not just things that we would expect, crimes, theft, and other things. It could be things like forgetting to update your address with the Immigration Service, which is an obligation that all foreign nationals have here. Or it could be you're out running an errand and you don't have your immigration document on us. How many of us carry our passports around? Very few. We keep those documents away for safekeeping. And the same is true with many people when it comes to their green cards or the passport that carries their visa stamp. Well, it's going to be important for people to carry those documents with them, because the ramifications of failing to do so, particularly if you're caught even in a traffic stop or something like that, could be pretty significant. So, there's obviously a lot of concern among the foreign national communities, not just what we would consider as sort of undocumented, but also among the many skilled foreign workers who are here in the United States temporarily or even as green card holders. Okay, let's move on to some of the other things that we're looking to see. So birthright citizenship is an issue that President Trump spent some time on during his campaign, and one of his executive orders declared that individuals who are born in the United States and don't have at least one parent who is a citizen or a green card holder would not be entitled to birthright citizenship. Now, the thing that the Trump administration is turning on to take that position, which by the way is not a widely held one, even among very conservative legal scholars, it is not something that is widely held, the position that the administration is taking. But they're looking at this clause in the 14th Amendment that addresses birthright citizenship and seems to limit it to those who are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And the argument that some in the administration are making is that folks here who are in temporary immigration status, that's lawful status, as well as those who are undocumented, their children are not necessarily entitled to birthright citizenship. And so, we're familiar with the arguments pertaining to undocumented foreign nationals and what are often called birth tourists who purportedly come to the United States to give birth to a child and then, endow that child with U.S. citizenship. We're also talking about folks who are here on work visas like H-1B and L-1 who may be being sponsored for green cards by their employers. This executive order would say that their children, if born in the United States, are not U.S. citizens at birth. So right now, that executive order is enjoined by a court temporarily, and the judges in those cases are hearing arguments as to why or why not those judges should issue a longer-term injunction against the amendment. So the executive order. So it's going to be very interesting to watch that issue play out. There's long-standing Supreme Court precedent on the birthright citizenship issue. There's also, and this is being less reported on, there's long-standing, though not quite as old as the birthright citizenship, there's long-standing Supreme Court jurisprudence that says undocumented immigrants are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So it's going to be really interesting. This may be an executive order that does not get held even by the Supreme Court, but future court decisions might perhaps present a roadmap for how it could become, there could be an executive order or a statute that the Supreme Court might decide passes muster and they deem it within the Constitution that might limit birthright citizenship. So many interesting things to follow on that very, very important issue. Okay, moving ahead. Humanitarian immigration. So this has been a subject of quite a bit of debate, really, for the last, from the, back into the Obama administration. We saw around the world humanitarian crises that materialized into border crises, where refugees from countries under threat throughout the world were applying for asylum. So in Europe, we saw that to a great degree back in 2007, 2008. Similarly, it began at the US southern border with a vengeance at that time, and it has continued. In the United States, we also have the issue of individuals who came here to the United States as very young children and have really only known this country as a home. And many of those have benefits under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. We also have a number of countries that are designated for temporary protected status, which gives protection from deportation and work authorization to nationals of a whole array of countries who are in very, very difficult circumstances, whether it's due to environmental crises or other things. So Haiti, El Salvador, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Nicaragua, those are all countries with temporary protected status. And lastly, in recent years, we've seen a lot of activity on helping to give humanitarian parole, so the ability to enter the United States for individuals from a number of countries. They're actually able to leave their countries where they are in peril and come to the US with this special protection called parole. Well, all of those programs are under some threat, and there are those who have very strongly felt views about the United States as the principal aid to immigrants in peril. As a practical matter, there are quite a number of these people here in the United States and who've been here for a very long time. At the bottom there, you'll see some just graphics on simply DACA, TPS, and humanitarian parole. We've got, well over 2 million individuals, some of whom have been here for quite a long time. And these are active members of the workforce. Many corporations employ folks in DACA and TPS, and many individuals have sponsored family members and friends under humanitarian parole programs for Ukraine and other countries. So apart from the humanitarian interest, there's also the fact that limiting these programs, which President Trump has strong intentions to do, might have a very significant impact on the US economy, because you can't just strip out 2.5 million workers and not see an economic impact and potentially a very negative inflationary impact. So these are all things that we're watching for. And again, there are certainly concerns of advocacy groups and immigrant groups and humanitarian groups, but also of many major corporations in the United States who have many of these folks in their workforce, and they care about protecting their interests. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So this is this very interesting debate that is shaping up around migration, but particularly skilled migration. And that is the whole question of skilled migration, and whether skilled migration programs are something that the US government supports or tries to place limitations on. So I think there's this idea that there's one side of things, the sort of far right side, and then there's the view of the tech industry executives, kind of led by Elon Musk, and that they are at loggerheads. And to a certain extent, that may be true. There are those in the administration who would really like to see a suspension of all migration programs and view skilled migration programs as really detrimental to the US workforce. There are others who hold less strong views, but I think one of the things that I think is not maybe paid attention to quite as much is that these two groups, while they seem sort of diametrically opposed, may well have some interests in common and some restrictions or limits on current immigration programs that they could all live with. And some of those things include higher wage thresholds for certain immigration programs. Many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with the H-1B program, which has very strict regulations on the wages that need to be paid to H-1B workers. They have to be the higher of the prevailing wage for the occupation in the geographic area where the person will work, and with the same skill set. And the higher of that, and the actual wage that the employer pays to similarly situated workers in those roles. So we're not talking about a minimum wage in the sense of the federal minimum wage. We are talking about wage minimums that the Department of Labor has determined are the prevailing ones for a geographic area. And so increasing those wage thresholds is something that both the tech folks and the far right might find some interest in. As we know, technology industry workers tend to be higher paid. It may be not a stretch for those organizations to accept an increase in wage minimums as a stricture, as a partial stricture on the H-1B and other programs. Higher scrutiny of employer compliance, always an issue. And, we are here, our firm is here, Scott and I are there and with our colleagues to help our corporate clients make sure that they are, in full compliance, and teach them how to do that and relay that information and knowledge throughout their organizations. And many of those organizations would be okay with the notion of more government scrutiny of their compliance. Changes to eligibility requirements are another area where there may actually be some common ground. If you have some familiarity with the H-1B program, you know that right now it's a very popular program. There is a cap on the number of H-1Bs that can be newly petitioned for every year, and that cap is 85,000. But we have hundreds of thousands of candidates for those roles, and we now distribute those very limited quota numbers by lottery, which I think no one will argue is a good way to distribute, slots in a highly coveted visa program. And there have been efforts in the past to supplant the lottery with a distribution system that grants H-1Bs to employers who are willing to pay the highest wages, or to foreign nationals who have the highest educational credentials. So making changes of that type might be something that many in the business community would favor, along with those on the far right. So it's not just a simple black and white debate. We could see changes. Employers need to be prepared for these, and not necessarily subscribe to the belief that the prominence of technology industry advisors means that there are going to be no changes to current immigration programs, or those changes are only going to be beneficial. So although tech industries, for instance, tech employers might be able to afford higher wage minimums, there are other industries where those minimums would be prohibitive in terms of sponsoring the foreign workers that they need. So it's going to be an interesting debate, that one too. And we've got two very kind of worthy leaders and formidable leaders on both sides. We have Elon Musk, and no one would question his tenacity and brilliance. And on the other side, we have, as sort of the unofficial leader of immigration policy in the Trump administration, Stephen Miller, who's now the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, and who similarly is a very sophisticated, very knowledgeable, and very determined representative of the restrictionist positions. Okay, happy to take questions, comments on some of those issues. We know there's a lot to say, and we've also probably stunned you into silence with just the volume of facts and points here, but happy to take questions.
I'll take the slides down just so we can see more of our faces.
Sure.
Yeah, in fact, so now I'm encouraging everyone to just type in, or if you'd like to speak because you have a long question and you don't want to type it all, just raise your hand or just take yourself off mute. So fascinating listening to this. And of course, yeah, we're watching daily changes. I guess one question I would have, we have people from academia on this list as well. All of these changes around students are, I guess, even more problematic. They're making 4-year commitments, or if they're, graduate students, they're making significant commitments to a lot of commitment of time, money, and travel to come to the United States and educate. what do you think you see coming from this? If you could, we'll trust your crystal ball. What do you think you're seeing for that?
Yeah, I think, and Scott can speak more to things that are going on overseas, because it's foreign students are always, and recent graduates are always, of a significant interest to, organizations, but also to governments. I think here in the United States, you're seeing kind of mixed messaging right now. I mean, we've heard President Trump say he loves the idea of skilled migration, really wants to, likes this idea of giving green cards to those who earn advanced degrees in the United States, and I think the question will be, is he going to come through on that promise? But even if he does, hand in hand with that, there's going to be some of the scrutiny of ideologies and social media use and other things, might well be very difficult for young people who are coming to the United States to withstand, in terms of their ability to engage in protest and take advantage of other First Amendment rights, and also things that they may have said or written on social media years ago might come up in a visa interview or in a green card interview if they get to that point. One of the things that was very, very interesting about an executive order that President Trump signed last night on combating anti-Semitism is that it contains a provision that asks government agencies to come up with ways to educate institutions of higher education on the national security related grounds of inadmissibility to the United States. So these are things that would bar a foreign national from coming into the United States, or maybe make them subject to deportation, and encourage them to monitor student populations and report those activities. Well, that's very, very problematic, and it is something that, that might deter students from coming here. We know higher ed is a major industry in our country, and we have a great interest in trying to retain the people that we educate and who come to this country with, long-term hopes of staying here and building their lives here. So I think we're going to see a bunch of things. I think maybe some good advice in the medium term for students in the near term is make sure to dot all your I's and cross all your T's in terms of compliance with your student visa obligations. So reporting your changes of address and making sure that your designated student official, knows where you're working, and making sure that you're in full compliance and are carrying documentation, because it will help minimize the risk now and in the future of things that might be a detriment or a roadblock to staying in the United States. And then in more practical terms, we could very well see restrictions on something called optional practical training, which is a program that allows F1 and certain other foreign students in the United States to have a year of post-study professional experience in a job that's related to their degree. And then if they have a degree in a STEM field, that can be up to 3 years of optional practical training. These are programs that many restrictionists do not like, and they have been challenged in court over the last several years without success. But we see that, the current administration may want to, from a regulatory perspective, put some strictures on those programs. But we also see, with the doing away of certain levels of deference to government agencies, that those plaintiffs in the past might find new ways to challenge these programs under new Supreme Court law and have success this time. So those are things that it's also really important to pay attention to, both for universities and for employers who are interested in recruiting top, foreign students to join their organizations.
So many of
Well,
our, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, one of the interesting things we're seeing, and Nancy touched on kind of the compliance and the vetting. One of the interesting things, I think, for the members here is one of the trends we see in the Immigration Trends Report is what I'll call the perfect storm, and it's around compliance. From a government perspective, you look at the economy today with the high inflation rates, and it's very similar to what we saw in 2007 and 2008. And during that time, what we saw was that governments almost used compliance as a revenue generating function. And so they became more vigilant in looking at how well companies were following rules. And the difference now is, from the immigration standpoint is, first off, there's just so much more data out there. There's more data out there. There's more data sharing out there in the EU, for example, although for EU citizens, it's freedom of movement between the EU, they still collect border data, share the border data. You just think of it on your desktop, you have tools like Tableau. Well, imagine the powerful computers that the governments have at their disposal. And then finally, what we're noticing from a immigration standpoint is the penalties for non-compliance are up, not just in terms of 3x in dollar terms or whatever the currency is, but I'll give an example. In New Zealand, they put this law into effect that if your violations were numerous enough or egregious enough, they could put you on a black list. And that blacklist meant that you couldn't bring in foreign nationals. In this case, sometimes it was just for seasonal hire or longer. So it's just the cost of non-compliance is going up. And Nancy talked about, I think, not to be underestimated, kids of today just posting something on social media. Well, that lives forever, and it's going to be easily accessible. And when, it wouldn't be surprising, as you go into your interview, so, oh, by the way, do you remember you posted X, Y, and Z 3, 5, 8 years ago? And so, we're seeing around the globe. You asked about the students, but I think in general, just globally, you're seeing more difficult, maybe not necessarily extreme vetting, but I think enhanced vetting around the globe is certainly on the rise, and the cost of non-compliance is clearly on the rise.
I think it'd be interesting if there are some faculty on the call that, are we worried that we're going to run out of graduate students? I happen to know when I did my PhD, there were 200 graduate students in the department, and 20 of them were American. So I can't imagine today what that would look like if many of those students, and a lot of them came from, because of what it was, countries that have oil, which also might be countries that might be constrained today to send students here. So that seems odd to me, as many of the people that I work with in my academic and then my business career came from other countries, were educated here and stayed here. So do we have any sense from the administration that says they want to increase this, that there's some target numbers, or is it just simply up, down? Anything that we can understand?
Target numbers for, say, a maximum number of foreign students in the United States. Yeah,
Right.
it's a really interesting point. I haven't seen it expressed as numbers, but and truthfully, it's actually kind of difficult to find good data on the numbers of foreign students in the fields that they're studying in. But I think the restrictions the administration might put in place probably won't focus on numbers, but simply on processes that essentially slow down the ability of entry to the United States, and to kind of put impediments in place that eventually kind of wear people out, and they look elsewhere. So for instance, this whole notion of subjecting many more individuals to security clearances, including those who haven't been accustomed to it in the past, it's really a question of slowing down the system so that fewer people are approved quickly, delays in onboarding. And then if you're waiting for someone to come in and fill a position in your department and you really need that person, but they're stuck in a background check that lasts for a year, or even 2 months, you're in a very, very difficult situation in terms of needing those skills and not being able to meet them with this person that you've identified as a fit for your organization. And then multiply that by, hundreds and hundreds and thousands, and you can readily see the impact.
And Lynn, what I found interesting was when, President-elect Trump gave the speech last year in which he said, we'll hand them the sheepskin and we'll hand them the green card. Typically afterwards, his handlers would walk back that statement. Well, we didn't see them walking it back. What they said is, yes, this is correct. They're just going to be subject to, again, an intense vetting process. So the concept, and it was something of a surprise. The concept wasn't pushed back at all, but they would just caveat it by saying, it's not going to be easy, but this, it's a viable concept.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about the political moment that we're in right now is this whole question of legislation. And I think we've, in the immigration field, have been accustomed to really not expecting any significant legislation. It hasn't happened for decades. Gridlock in Congress and the politicization of immigration as an issue has made it almost impossible. But one thing that we saw very, very quickly in this new Congress was some bipartisan support and ultimately a passage of a pretty strict immigration enforcement bill, the Lake and Riley Act. It covers other things, but it has some pretty strict provisions on detention and deportation of those who've committed crimes. And the fact that it got a not insignificant number of votes from Democrats suggests that, we could be in a political climate where we could see some broader based, immigration reform legislation. It might focus largely on enforcement and on restrictions, but there's certainly more of an appetite. And I should say more of an appetite, because I think one of the things that maybe doesn't get enough attention is that immigration isn't a single party issue. We've got restrictionists in both parties who are very active and collaborate frequently. You see, for instance, Chuck Grassley from Iowa and Dick Durbin from Illinois often have collaborated on bills to restrict, skilled visa programs. So there's interest on both sides. And maybe we're in a time where it's suddenly more possible to envision more significant immigration legislation.
All right, I'm going to call for any more questions. Ralph, I saw you pop up here, so I think you have some.
The OPT program has been a particular interest to us because, as ISBM is a big link between academia and industry. Mm-hmm. And of course, a large percentage of our students, particularly in the MBA program and some of the advanced programs, are foreign nationals. And I've personally played with quite a few OPTs, and I find this great because it allows for a transitional period for the student mm-hmm. and for the company where they really get to know one another.
That's right.
And the student can begin to build support, and the company begins to see, this is a real power hitter. Maybe we need to get behind him. So your opinion is that program really under fire? Is it sort of because I know a couple of times when I work with students on helping them access OPT, I occasionally was worried that I was going to get hauled off to jail because it was sort of a complex place to navigate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, again, a lot of the worries I have, like I kid around, I used to worry that I was going to die young, got that knocked, not going to happen. Then I used to get worried. I used to get worried that I would spend the rest of my life in jail because these rules were so complicated. The students would come to me and say, well, I can do an OPT. And they would try to say, look, I can make a link for you with one of our member firms, and I know you'll do good work. But you need to work with officers who understand today's view of the OPT. So is that, in your opinion, you've watching this now a lot more closely than I have over the past few years. Is that program likely to continue? Is it going to die? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's certainly those in the administration and advisors to the administration who would like to see it eliminated. I think as a practical matter, that probably won't happen. But that we can't rule out the possibility that a court might find it, an executive overreach or an administrative overreach and decide to invalidate it. That would get litigated heavily, as it has been in the past. But I think more likely are restrictions on the program. So right now it's 12 months for most who are outside of the STEM fields. And of those who have a degree in a limited number of STEM fields that have been identified by the Department of Homeland Security, they can get up to 3 years. And that 3 year STEM OPT period has been, you know, something that a lot of restrictionists really do not like. So, you know, I think it's more likely that we could see time periods reduced. We could see wage minimums introduced to those programs, and other things that simply make it more challenging for employers to take up, and possibly for students to comply with, or
Well,
qualify.
Scott and Nancy, and can shut me off on this if you'd like, Len, but that might be, I'm not sure that I mean, I'm thinking a class on the, or some sort of session on the OPT program, what's likely to happen, how to implement it. Because if you look at the ISBM membership, most of our firms are tech oriented. We're all manufacturing ingredients of some sort that go downstream. So most of the people that we work with, the students we work with that are interested in possibly using this OPT approach, have not only business backgrounds, but STEM backgrounds. Some of them are engineers that just got an MBA, or they're getting their MBA, and when it's worked, it just seems like a win-win-win.
Absolutely. And look, this is companies don't set out to hire a person on the basis of their citizenship or national origin. They want most talented. And when graduate programs are filled with talented people, and many of them are not US citizens or green card holders, you know, it doesn't matter. They want the best candidates. And that's one of the reasons that OPT is such a fruitful program, and so beneficial to our country. You know, there are those who believe it's not restrictive enough, that it undercuts the employment of US workers, or depresses wages. And listen, anybody can find data to back up either side of the argument. But I think, you know, in terms of on the ground, it works, and it's something that's very, very beneficial to the US economy, to individual businesses, and to, you know, our position in the world as a desirable destination to come and study and live and all the rest. So, you know, I hope it won't happen, but and I think things are going to be very, very unpredictable. You know, we're already seeing in this first 10 days a practice of sort of putting out a very draconian seeming requirement or order, and then pulling back on it, or when you look more deeply at the order, it's not a direct order to take action. It's an order to consider action and come up with recommendations for the next 6 or 12 months. So, you know, we're all going to need to watch this carefully, because changes don't just happen in the headlines. They happen, and we like to say this a lot, there are things you'll never see written about in the New York Times or the Washington Post, or, you know, the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal. But there are things that affect the efficiency of the immigration system, you know, which is already, you know, kind of on its knees administratively, and in terms of resources and personnel. And that too, probably more than anything, it makes it difficult to attract and retain foreign talent.
Well, thank you. It's such a moving target that I don't know that even at our university, if we have experts that really have their eye on the ball as it's moving all over the place. I know that you can set up the talent and someone who needs the talent, and they'll get along just fine. But then navigating the stream of hurdles that changes every day, that it's making it tough. I hope that program survives.
Yes.
All right, I'll make one more last call for anything. Let's see. I'm just going to scroll down to see if there's anything more here. Nope. Paul says complex and ambiguous. Thank you, Paul. Yes,
and we have a winner.
Complex and ambiguous, right? Absolutely. All right. So we're just short of 2 o'clock, so I'm going to actually just call this